Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining in from, to the fourth Global Town Hall meeting with David J. Anderson, sponsored and hosted by Digite. A warm welcome to all of the people who are already in, and we expect many more people to join in. And we'll probably give them a couple of more minutes to come in. In the meantime, just a few requests here that if you have questions for David, please have them ready and type them into the Q&A box that you see to the bottom right of your screen. I will be the moderator for the show, and I will for the webinar, and I will read out the questions and ask them to David. On the bottom left of the screen, you will see icons that will allow you to switch between full screen display and in a smaller window. We can use that to move, toggle between the two depending on what you want to do. I will give one more minute and then we can get started here. All right, very warm welcome to everybody on the call. This is the fourth Global Town Hall meeting that we're doing with David. We've had a phenomenal success with these conferences because it has allowed people from nearly 5 or 6 continents to participate in a single session and be able to ask questions to David directly and listen into the discussion on all of the questions that get asked during the webinar. This town hall meeting style has really given us a great way to interact with all of you and to understand some of the challenges that you face as you evaluate various agile methods, including Scrum and Kanban, and apply them to your own specific situations, whether you are in the corporate IT, whether you are an IT services organization, an ISV, or even a non-technology, non-software type of organization. So let's get started. The agenda for today's discussion, we'll do a quick introduction and then a quick word about Digite, the sponsor of the webinar, and then we'll straight away get on to the Q&A mode. We will start with having David respond to a few high-level questions, and then we'll start to take on audience questions, and at the end we will wrap up. The session itself will run for about between about 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the number of questions that come in. With that, let me first introduce the speaker, David J. Anderson, President of David J. Anderson Associates. As always, most of you probably already know him, but those of you who don't, let me provide a more detailed introduction to David. David Anderson is a thought leader and a pioneer in the field of lean Kanban for software development and managing effective software teams. He has over 25 years of experience in the software industry, starting with computer games in the early 1980s. He's led software teams delivering great productivity and quality using innovative agile methods. David has written 2 books. The first one is Agile Management for Software Engineering, Applying the Theory of Constraints for Business Results. And the second one is Kanban, Successful Evolutionary Change for Your Technology Business. David is also founder of the Lean SFC, Lean Software and Systems Consortium, which is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to promoting greater professionalism and better economic outcomes in our industry. David is, of course, the president and CEO of DJ Anderson and Associates. DJ Anderson Associates provides consulting, coaching, and training services to organizations adopting Kanban and Lean methods of software development, DevOps, and IT operations, besides even general other business functions. And last but not the least, I'm very honored to say that David is also an advisor to Digite and consults with us for overall product strategy, especially in the areas of Lean Kanban. My name is Mahesh Singh. I'm co-founder and senior vice president for product at Digite, and I will be your moderator today, as well as will provide any other direction needed during the call to make sure that the overall questions and answers go smoothly. So let me first quickly give you an overview of who Digite is. We are a pioneer in web-based collaborative products and solutions for geographically distributed teams, and we focused on facilitating distributed teams being able to work effectively on software projects with a very strong collaboration platform. We are headquartered in Mountain View, California, and have a presence in US, Europe, and Asia, specifically India. We have over 250,000 users across the world using our products and services. Our products cover lean, Kanban, agile, ALM, project portfolio management type of products. And Swift-Kanban is our flagship lean Kanban product for software development as well as for other business users, other business functions. We were named by Gartner in the ALM Market Scope report for 2010, so we got a fair bit of recognition for the work that we have done so far in the application lifecycle management and agile project management space. Just a quick smattering of some of our key customers, and you'll see that we have customers that span multiple industries and multiple types of IT organizations, as their corporate IT services, or ISVs, and so on. So with that, let me welcome David on the call, and you will see on the slide here general instructions for attendees as we start to get into the audience question answers. David, can you hear me?
Good morning, Mahesh.
Good morning, David.
I was expecting your colleague to take me off mute there, but okay, so we've taken care of that. I hope you can hear me well today.
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear, and I hope that the audience can also hear you. So welcome back, David. You've been really traveling extensively in the last several weeks, I would say months even, attending the conferences in Europe, and of course probably doing other consulting and training assignments.
That's right. In the last 10 weeks, I've been on the road for 9 of those weeks, mostly in Europe. I've actually lost count of how many countries, but I've been across most of Europe teaching, attending various conferences, the Lean Agile Scrum Switzerland, Agile Cambridge, Lean Kanban Benelux, Lean Kanban Central Europe, the LESS 2011, the Lean Enterprise Software and Systems in Stockholm. And I've really been able to take the pulse of the Lean Kanban community across Europe in the last 3 months. So
that's great. So in fact, I thought that perhaps a good starting point for us in the town hall today might be for you to give us all an overview of the state of affairs as far as Kanban is concerned. We've seen several large conferences completed, and as we sort of close out 2011, where do things stand as we approach the end of 2011, and what do you think the Lean Agile community and software community in general can look forward to in 2012 with regard to Kanban?
Good question. I've been thinking about this a little recently. While I was in Munich at the Lean Kanban Central Europe, a company from Hamburg called Jimdo had mentioned to me over lunch that it was 1 year to the day since they had adopted Kanban. I believe that they'd been at the DevOps days in Hamburg a year earlier, where I had done a fishbowl session over lunchtime, and they'd adopted it and followed up from there. It made me stop and think that how far had we come. If they had come that far in 1 year, how far had we come? Well, 5 years earlier, there was only one company in the world doing Kanban. And if we look now, just in the last week or so, the Kanban Dev Yahoo group passed 2,000 members. And in addition to that, we have Kanban implementations on 5 continents at least. Just last week, I heard of another one in Hong Kong with a very well-known international brand clothing and apparel company, and the consultant involved in introducing that had been giving a presentation at the World CIO Forum conference, and we have really quite extensive global reach, large companies on 5 continents, and at the other end of the scale, startup companies on 5 continents. This year there was 4 conferences: the Lean Software and Systems in Long Beach, California, Lean Kanban Central Europe, Lean Kanban Benelux, LESS in Stockholm. Altogether 840 attendees. We now have Kanban classes available in 26 countries and at least 5 languages. The largest implementations we know of involve thousands of people. There's a very large Australian company working with David Joyce, a former winner of the Brickell Key Award from the Lean Software and Systems Consortium for his achievements with Kanban at the BBC in London. And now he's working with literally thousands of people at one of Australia's largest companies. We've seen the spin-off of the personal Kanban movement, and that's really growing rapidly. There's perhaps 15 or more tools that you can get for your mobile phone or your iPad or some sort of tablet computer for tracking your personal Kanban. There are 6 books about Kanban, my own and several others, some of them actually originally written in the German language. My own book's now translated into German, Spanish, and Brazilian Portuguese, and we have French, Italian, Japanese, and Chinese in development. We've seen some well-documented case studies, some of them by well-respected academics. And typically these case studies are demonstrating 200 to 700% throughput improvements after teams adopt Kanban, really regardless of their starting position, whether it's a traditional SDLC or something more modern like Scrum or some other agile method. Introducing Kanban really seems to be helping teams focus and helping them think about improvements and then implementing those. We've seen lead time reductions of as much as 90%. And meanwhile, our community continues to gather data and reports hard facts and thinks and acts scientifically. Only yesterday, we saw a Kanban consultant from South Africa, Karen Greaves, reporting data from one of our clients in South Africa, 18 months worth of velocity data presented in the control chart. And not only does the community feel the need to do that, that sort of information is very useful and often corroborates with existing data. In that particular example, it demonstrated that velocity tends to vary around the mean by a factor of plus or minus 2 times. In other words, the mean velocity, the high end, the fastest that particular team might be observed going is twice the mean, and the slowest is half of the mean. And data like that's very useful because it helps us point out that mean velocity is really only useful as a long-term planning mechanism. It's not useful for short-term planning because the spread of variation is so great. And of course, guidance like that goes against the guidance that's typically been available from Agile experts and in the Scrum community in the last decade. And it's really only because people are reporting hard facts and real evidence from around the world that we can demonstrate that that guidance really isn't very good, because people tend to get rather emotionally attached to it. So just repeated production of real data from real teams from all over the world is the way that we improve this industry and the professionalism and the economic performance that we're all capable of.
Great. There's several things that you said that I would come back to in terms of follow-up questions, but I think everything that you said makes sense. We are seeing a lot of what I can term as traction from the various types of organizations that are looking to Kanban for improving operational efficiencies and overall quality, improvement of quality of products and services delivery. Couple of questions there from your perspective. Do you see a specific segment of the overall population much more inclined to explore Kanban and adopt Kanban? For example, are people who are currently used to Agile and Scrum, are they the ones who are investigating Kanban the most? Or do you see IT? Obviously, I think one of the things that we hear is that IT is the leading sort of set of community that is leading the adoption of Kanban. But do you also see non-IT functions in organizations aggressively or interestedly looking at Kanban?
We're definitely seeing a growth into other areas outside of IT, usually in companies where they've adopted Kanban in IT first. Not always though, but it tends to be where they've adopted it in IT first. Earlier this week, I met a company in Vienna where they started with the software development and now they're using it in their marketing operations and to help with their management of their partner community around the world. And it does seem to be generally applicable for knowledge work problems, not just software development as a specialist area within knowledge work. However, it's still very early days, and clearly we started in software development, and that's where our expertise and backgrounds lie. And the focus of my own business is still very much to continue with software development and IT operations until we've really established it as I'm struggling for the right language here, a common way of working, that it's somewhat ubiquitous in that industry, in our profession, before we really start thinking about trying to spread it elsewhere. My own background is software development, so I have some credibility in that space. I don't feel comfortable going and telling architects or lawyers or marketing people that they should be changing the way they're working. I very much rather that they look at what we're doing and think, well, that might be interesting for us, we should give it a try. In other words, I want to see pull from those other industries and other professions rather than us try and push into those markets. Then you asked me about industries that we see strong Kanban adoption. The media industry continues to be by far the strongest, in my opinion. The freedom from time-boxed iterations that Kanban offers continues to be a major attraction. But I believe the media industry also appreciates the class of service concept, and they appreciate the service level agreement, lead time focus. So Kanban provides a flexibility that's very attractive to media companies, and really quite a broad range of media companies, from newspapers and TV companies through online website properties and movie companies.
Excellent, great. And again, that reflects some of the type of organizations that we are talking to as well. So there are a number of audience questions that are coming in, David. So I'm going to go ahead and start with them. I just initially wanted to briefly pay respect to a very respected member of the Agile community based out of UK, Grant Rule, who passed away recently, and I had the good fortune of meeting him in Antwerp in the Lean-Kanban Benelux conference, and we actually had a very interesting discussion. He came to our booth, and we had a very interesting discussion around tracking of elapsed time versus the effort spent on tasks in Kanban. So I thought maybe as a mark of respect, I would start with that question first, or that point first. And this is regarding the fact that in Swift-Kanban, the tool that we provide, we track elapsed time in progress lanes versus wait lanes, and time that is tracked in the in progress lanes is labeled as work time. And Grant's point was that work time on a card is really the actual time that a person who is assigned to the card spends working on the card, not necessarily the time that the card is actually sitting in that lane. And he wanted us to differentiate between the two and track work time separate from the lane time, so to speak. And to me, that sort of represented the classic a distinction between what Scrum does versus what Kanban does. Scrum tracks burn down and therefore needs effort data for that. The Kanban tracks lead time and cycle time and needs elapsed time for that. So how do you resolve this? Do you Scrum teams that are doing this, Scrum teams that are starting to use Kanban, should they be tracking both effort and elapsed time? And should Kanban tools or Scrum tools be providing both sets of metrics? How does this? How do we handle this situation?
So I need to come back to the core guidance that we provide on adopting Kanban, and the principle that you start with what you're doing now, that it's about evolutionary, incremental change, and introducing change in a way that minimizes the resistance, so that you can spread the improvements around your organization and institutionalize those improvements. So if we have a team, regardless of what method they might be using, if they're tracking time on task and level of effort, and there's an organizational requirement for them to continue doing so, then they have to continue doing that. And it's certainly true that some agile methods like Scrum do require estimates and tracking of actual effort. Over the years, terms have been used such as ideal time, which is this concept of hours that you would spend totally focused on work and never being interrupted by anything else. And that's fine. People have been doing that. I personally have never found those concepts useful, whether we're dealing with traditional software development life cycles and project management methods, or some agile methods. If you look at my own writing and the writing of others on the feature-driven development method that I was involved in more than a decade ago, there's no tracking of time on task and effort expended. I understand the need, why some people feel a need to track time on task. They want to do some sort of cost accounting, right, for the time spent. And I really see all of that as 20th century management accounting legacy. It's cost and management accounting legacy. It's a fact of life that many people have to do it, but I don't think it's particularly useful. And to be honest, I don't think customers really care all that much. they care much more about how long it takes to deliver something, how predictable that delivery is, and how good the quality is. And the brutal reality is that the costs are mostly fixed. So if we want to know the cost per user story, for example, we would simply take the fixed cost of running a team and divide it by the velocity, how many user stories were produced in a period of time. And of course that produces an average, and often the objections raised that averages are not giving us a specific enough information to help with prioritization. And I understand the objection, but my observation is it's still not particularly useful. The mechanisms that we're adopting into Kanban related to cost of delay and risk profiling and the use of classes of service around those risk profiles tend to provide much better management information and are producing better results. Of course, if you're introducing Kanban with the principle of you start with what you do now, you don't show up and say, my way of doing things is better than yours, so we are going to stop doing your way and just do mine. Therefore, I think people have to do both, and the challenge for tool vendors like you is supporting that transition period, because often we observe with prioritization schemes, with governance schemes that involve, say, ROI calculations that need a time on task or a cost estimate, we often find that teams will continue to do those for a few weeks or months or even several quarters after they adopt Kanban, until they realize that they're going through the motions and not actually using that information to make decisions. And then at some time they drop it. But there is that interim period, and if you're selling the tool, you need to be able to span that interim period. So I think it's somewhat unfortunate, because you're building features that you know that ultimately customers won't use, but they're features that if you don't include them, they'll become an impediment to adoption and of course an impediment to growing your market share.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that is that key aspect of transition. Is definitely one of the areas where we see ourselves and probably our customers struggling to see how do they continue to do something that they were doing while making changes to it in a way that sort of makes overall sense for the organization and that the team can sort of smoothly work with. So let me ask a sort of related question that's coming from Richard Hall. And this is again similar in some respects to what we just discussed. But so specifically for Scrum teams that are adopting Kanban, what are some of the key aspects that they focus on, and what are some sort of key points of adoption that you can mention, you can provide that will help them make the transition? Is there something that is more specific to teams currently using Scrum?
Okay, so did you paste that question into Skype so that I can?
Yes.
It does seem a very broad and general question, so it's difficult to provide an answer. What are the key aspects of Kanban that they focus on? Generalizations are always so dangerous, because every situation is unique and different, and we really teach people adopting Kanban to analyze their current situation very carefully, to look at their demand and their current capabilities and sources of customer dissatisfaction and sources of internal team dissatisfaction. There are a number of patterns that we observe with some organizations using Scrum. For example, testers might complain that at the beginning of a sprint they're underutilized or idle, and at the end they're having to work overtime in order to try and finish testing to meet the sprint commitment.
Mm-hmm.
And we might observe that that's in an organization that has 3 or 4 Scrum teams, but it has one testing team, which is a shared resource across the 4 Scrum teams. If you adopt Kanban in a situation like that, the first thing you will say is, well, our testing appears to be some kind of capacity-constrained resource, a bottleneck, and therefore we should protect it with a WIP limit. So we put a WIP limit on testing, and this creates a tension to really decouple the synchronized cadence of the 3 or 4 Scrum teams. So imagine we had 4 Scrum teams and we were doing 3-week-long sprints. Typical Scrum guidance would suggest that those 4 teams should be completely synchronized. They should all start their sprint on the same day, and they should finish on the same day. Well, when you introduce Kanban, typically the WIP limit will force a desynchronization of those teams, so that they'll tend to move into a staggered effect where on any given week there's at least one team finishing a sprint and ready to start another one. So that's a sort of typical thing that comes up. We do notice other things. Often Scrum teams doing visualization are visualizing tasks within an individual team. And with Kanban, we're typically visualizing customer valued work items such as user stories or features. And therefore a Kanban board is usually capable of visualizing the work of several Scrum teams. 6 or 7 is not uncommon. 3 or 4 is straightforward. So we're typically visualizing at a different level. But it's really difficult to answer such a general question. There
Sure.
is, of course, an entire book on how to apply Kanban to teams starting with Scrum, and that's the Scrumban book by my former colleague Corey Ladis, who's also based here in Seattle. So I would really refer you to the Scrumban book and Corey's website.
Okay, great. And I agree with you that a little high-level question. But something that you said again there, the sort of asynchronous load or behavior between dev team, let's say, and QA teams. There's another question that that has come up, which is that we see the need to define resource levels, resource based WIP limits or team level WIP limits rather than at a lane level, because there are always senior resources who are required at multiple stages of a software development lifecycle, who may do things like code reviews or document reviews, etc. And things tend to pile up at their end. So is it advisable to be looking at defining team level WIP limits or resource level WIP limits rather than lane level WIP limits?
I'm looking at the text of the question as you've typed it in for me, and I'm really wondering what a resource level WIP limit or a team level WIP limit really means, as opposed to a lane level. And by lane, do we mean a horizontal lane, and what is that lane for? Is it for different work item types or different classes of service or different customers? Does a lane represent an individual cohesive team or not? Are team members flexible and can work across different lanes? So really a question like that is too difficult to answer without actually seeing the design and the policies that are in place for the specific Kanban implementation. So I'll see what I can do in terms of a response, despite the fact that it's really hard to interpret. So it then says, because we have senior people who would like to do things like code reviews, and these tend to pile up on their end. So what you're really saying there is that we suspect that the code review activity is some sort of bottleneck, or is observed, has the appearance of being a bottleneck, because the senior people who do the reviewing are not instantly available.
Correct.
And therefore, you should approach that problem from the idea of, we have a non-instant availability problem, which is introducing an unevenness in our flow, and it's exhibiting bottleneck appearance. And there's a chapter in my book on this topic that's worth referencing. I believe it's chapter 16, maybe chapter 17 actually. And I'm looking at this thinking, well, we need to visualize this problem. So do we have a lane, a column on our board for review? Do we have a box perhaps where we put tickets queuing for review? Do we mark on the ticket itself whether it needs a review or not? Perhaps we have a checkbox that says review required, review required and completed. And if review is going to be required, that box is checked, and we can therefore visualize the number of tickets which are flowing in the direction of the review process and perhaps queuing for review. And that will enable us to identify to visualize the size of the problem, the magnitude of it, and to see the dynamics of it. It's a non-instant availability problem, so the analogy I used in the book is that of a ferry crossing a piece of water, a car ferry, and the car ferry has a parking lot where cars park while they wait for the ferry to arrive, and then they load onto the ferry and the ferry leaves again. Well, we'd be interested in knowing how many cars are parked in that parking lot, what's the arrival rate of them, how often does the ferry sail, does the parking lot become overloaded, and does the ferry become capacity constrained at certain peak times, and so on. So we're interested in knowing the same information for a non-instant availability problem, such as senior developers who do code reviews. So we need to visualize it, we need to gather visual, empirical data. We might actually record information that we can analyze statistically and take a look at it to discover what exactly is the problem. Then we can discuss how we might fix it, how we might improve the availability of the people that do the reviewing, or increase the number of people who can do it, or perhaps obviate the need for a review by using some alternative mechanism to ensure quality. But the first stage is to visualize it, and I'm not convinced that that's specifically a general width limit setting problem. It's much more specific. It's about, metaphorically speaking, it's about how big does the parking lot need to be while we wait for the ferry to come in.
And I can probably also relate to some of the experience we have, listening to our customers talk about it during demos and discussions. That typically, if you look at board design, the vertical lanes are based on the actual value stream, specs, design, development, testing, and each of them might have their own review lanes as well. And the horizontal lanes are typically based on type of work, so it could be class of service as an example. And you might define WIP limits both for the vertical as well as for the horizontal lanes. Now, on top of that, here this additional constraint refers to that there are a few senior resources who are playing a role in multiple columns. And is there a way to, first of all, define a WIP limit for those resources, or for that, let's say, specialist team? And even if we do that WIP limit, how do we actually implement it? That's sort of the general discussion that we see happening. So there is potentially a multi-dimensional WIP limit definition needed, but obviously, in terms of actually using it, that can still get tricky.
So we do see some solutions to that, particularly with physical boards. It's not uncommon for teams to have a WIP limit per team member mechanism. So a WIP limit per person or per resource, and that might manifest itself using, for example, magnets on a magnetic physical board, where they'll use either magnets with people's names printed on them or with some sort of avatar, maybe based on South Park characters, for example. And if they have a policy of a maximum of 3 things per person, then there will be 3 magnets. One that I saw earlier this week in Vienna, they had a concept of 3 things per person, but one of them was a primary thing and 2 of them were secondary. So they had different sizes of avatar. They had a large avatar to designate the primary activity the person was working on, and 2 much smaller magnets with smaller avatars to represent secondary items, up to a maximum of 3. In addition, the board had both columns and lanes, and the columns and lanes could optionally have WIP limits. I'm not sure how many. I just don't remember all the features in your product, Mahesh, or for that matter, any of the other products, to know whether they can currently do that. But that's one way that we see people with physical boards dealing with the issue. Of course, that all that really does is, if anything, just highlight the described problem even more.
Right.
That if our person is doing code reviews and they can only handle a maximum of 3, where are we showing the other things queuing? I suspect that if you think this is your problem, what you do is you redesign your board and put a column on the board for code review with a WIP limit, and you might even have a ready for review as a buffer in front of the code review column. And that buffer, that extra column that represents the buffer, is the equivalent of the parking lot where people park their car to wait for the ferry to come in. I think that's how I would deal with it, using a column or a box on a board, maybe even 2, one that's a buffer and one that's an actual activity, and I'd set a WIP limit on it. If you're looking for WIP limits per person, then you need the concept that the workforce is flexible and can be moved across lanes or columns on the board, and there needs to be some way of visually representing those assignments.
Excellent. Another question that has come in, which again is more specific to the actual practice and design of the boards. This is from Karen, and she says that I'm looking for some tips or some sort of best practices to reduce lead time. We have come to a steady number, which I assume is for the lead time, that is controlled by the frequency of deployment. And so we've kind of reached a plateau in a way, I guess. And so what are some things that we could do to reduce lead time?
So again, Judge, reading between the lines of what was said there, it sounds like there's a regular cadence for deployment, and that things, let's imagine that was every 2 weeks. Well, things have to queue up and then be deployed in a batch every second week. And if we're measuring end to end from when the customer ordered it to when we delivered it, then the cadence of replenishing our input queue and the cadence of deployment will affect that end-to-end lead time. So it sounds like the question is really aimed at how do we improve the cadence of delivery or deployment rather than necessarily shrink the cycle time as work items move through our system.
Or perhaps it could also mean that how do we get more work done within that same cadence, so more items deployed in that same cadence?
Yeah, that's even more general, Mahesh.
Okay.
The thing is that the frequency that we can do deliveries is controlled by a number of economic elements. The transaction cost for us on doing the delivery, the transaction cost for our customers in taking delivery, and the coordination effort required amongst our own people and our customers in order for the delivery to happen. And the greater those costs, the less frequently we are going to want to do a delivery. So the question of can we do it more often is really one of how can we reduce the transaction costs of making and taking a delivery and coordinating the effort. If we look at an example from the Kanban community, then I think one of the most impressive would be Fidelis in Brazil. It's Alison Valley's company based in Victoria, who makes software for managing universities and colleges. And they actually invested quite heavily in features in their product to enable automated deployments and to make it much simpler for the customers to take delivery of upgrades. And they also spent time and energy educating their customers on the entire process of requesting new features and then setting their expectation to take delivery of those new features very frequently. In the case of Fidelis, as often as twice a week. So an element of their overall feature mix, the different types of features they're building, they are allocating a proportion of those to be features designed to make it easier to deliver the product. In other words, in lean terms, they're designed for manufacture or designed for serviceability type of features rather than specifically customer valued features. The benefit of which is reduced cadence or rather reduced transaction and coordination costs, which allow them to increase the cadence, to increase the frequency of delivery, and of course significantly reduce the lead time from taking a customer's order to actually deploying it back to the customer.
All right. Let me take up another sort of operational question. And again, this is something that has come both from multiple customers of ours as well as from internal work that we do in building our own product. And let me go ahead and enter this question so that all participants can also see it on the chat box. Some people have requested that I type in the question there as well. And the question is that there is frequently a need to define dependencies between cards. For example, to be able to say that card 1 can only be done after card 2 is done. Do you see this need coming up in teams that you train or people who adopted Kanban come back to you saying this is the kind of dependency that one needs to be able to define on a Kanban board?
Oh, for sure. We see this often. I'd say that it comes up in probably 3 out of every 4 classes that we teach on at least one of the usually 3 or 4 groups that we have within the class. We typically split classes into groups of approximately 6 people. So we see it very often, and just based on those numbers, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the time. And people ask, how do we visualize it? Well, if you're using a physical board, you've really only got 2 or 3 dimensions. You've got, physically the height and the width of the board, and you've got the color of the tickets and perhaps the physical position that you place them on the board. Some dependencies are easier to visualize than others with physical boards. Parent-child relationships, for example, the relationship between an epic and a set of user stories, that's fairly straightforward to visualize using lanes. The same would be true of, say, a user story broken out into tasks. Those are not difficult. The type of dependencies that are difficult to visualize physically it involve the idea that 3 or 4 items need to be built in a sequence or all need to be deployed together because there's some technical dependency between them. To be honest, I have really never made much effort to visualize those dependencies. With the teams that I managed in my last real job in 2007, we did have this problem quite often, and we used the electronic tool to track those dependencies in terms of the peer relationships and perhaps some notes that would be stored in the work items telling us the nature of the dependency. And that was sufficient. When it comes to, for example, queue replenishment on the input queue, if you are going to pick an item and from its electronic record you see that it's dependent on 2 other things that must happen first, well, you might state that, yes, we would like to start this item, but it needs these other 2 items done first. So you would pull them in preference. And you might even make a decision to exceed the width limit on the queue. If you had 3 dependent items and one of them you really want to pull, you only have 1 slot free in the queue, you might choose to pull all 3, exceed the queue's width limit, and therefore you won't replenish the input queue for a while until it has shrunk down again to a small enough size. But this ensures that you introduce the dependent items together. Doing something like that will, of course, have some impact on your lead time metrics and potentially the due date performance against an SLA. So you need to be careful what you're doing. But if visualizing something is too complicated, then maybe it's worth accepting that it's not an easily solved problem with physical boards. And it's, in my opinion, a great opportunity for electronic Kanban board vendors like yourself to find ways of solving that problem. It affects, I would say, 1/3 to 1/2 of the people we encounter. And unfortunately, it's currently creating a mental impediment to adoption. That some people feel they must have a solution to that problem before they can move forward. And therefore, if you had a solution in an electronic tool, that would offer them a viable alternative.
Right. And of course, as a product vendor, and especially in product management, it becomes a challenging task to sort of define the limits of how much one might build a functionality, something like that, where it starts to compete with existing project management tools like Microsoft Project and others. But certainly, as you rightly said, there is an opportunity here.
I think it's worth pointing out that if you add dependency capability, it's quite likely people will overuse it, that they will see and imagine dependencies where they don't really exist.
Right, right. Good point.
And then it starts to look like some sort of dependency graph, like a Gantt chart. That, to be honest, the dependency problem, while it does exist, it doesn't seem to be that big of an impediment for most people. Peer-to-peer style dependencies, while they might affect 1/3 to 1/2 of the people that we encounter, it's perhaps only 10 or 15% of the volume of work that they perform that's really got that type of dependency. And if you take more of a Pareto approach to, do we have a good enough solution to move forward, then solving that dependency issue isn't that big of a deal. It shouldn't be an impediment to adopting Kanban. Asking a simple question like, is this ticket dependent on another one, and can we look up an electronic tracking tool to discover the answer, that could be good enough. In some cases, I've encouraged people simply to mark tickets with dependencies with something as simple as a colored dot, and just the existence of the dot is enough to alert you to go and check in the electronic system for the dependencies. If things are queuing for release and you have some things that are marked as dependent, then whoever's in charge of making the release should go and check the dependencies, check whether they are also in the queue or not, and if not, then take an appropriate action in the configuration management and version control system in order to ensure that items that don't have all their dependent items with them are not pushed into production accidentally.
Right, right, absolutely. There are a number of other questions that are coming in, David, which are somewhat high level. So first of all, I want to just let all the attendees know that we might go over the 1 hour time limit, and we hope that most of you can stay and listen to the rest of the discussion. So David, let me shoot another question. This is coming from Alexei Zaglo. And he says that Eric Ries in the Lean Startup book describes the build, measure, learn cycle as a Kanban system. Validated knowledge instead of feature is the output. The goal is to minimize the cycle time. Do you believe that the Kanban method is useful for improving such systems? And while you ponder over it, let me just also enter that in the chat box for all other participants to see.
Okay. First of all, I was expecting to be here for 90 minutes, so I'm quite happy to stay for another half an hour if necessary. I'm not quite sure what to say to this question. It's clear to me that a Kanban system has some very, very basic elements to it, that there needs to be a WIP limit, and that we only pull new work when there's available capacity, and there needs to be some sort of signaling mechanism to say that there's available capacity. And the Kanban method or approach to change is a way of doing incremental evolutionary changes, where a Kanban system is deployed as the mechanism for creating the stress on the organization that provokes the conversations about the problems and challenges that the process has, and to come up with potential improvement suggestions. It's not clear to me from that description how that matches with the build, measure, learn cycle. That are we saying that in Lean Startup and build, measure, learn, we are limiting the number of things that we're build, measuring, and learning, and that at some point we decide we've learned enough and we call that finished, and then we pull some other idea to start build measuring and learning from. If that's true, then it is a Kanban system, that there is a Kanban system underlying that mechanism. But to be honest, I'm not sure that we need to keep stretching and merging things. It seems to me perfectly reasonable that Lean Startup has its build, measure, learn cycle, and that model exists and is distinct from the model that we're using with Kanban to provoke Kaizen cultures in organizations. And I don't see a great deal of value in trying to say that these two things are similar or related or the same thing or otherwise. I find it reasonable that I can hold both of those models in my head and learn when to use them as appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And coming back to the company I visited in Vienna earlier this week, they're called Tupelo. They make a local search engine, website and mobile phone software. They use Kanban, and they've been doing it for 18 months. And I also noticed a significant number of copies of the Lean Startup book around their office. And I met the founders, and it was clear to me that the founder I spoke to for a while during the hour or so I spent with them, he valued both of these mechanisms, but he saw them as applicable in different aspects of his business. And I think that that's perfectly fine. I think it's fine for people to see the value in Lean Startup and to see the value in Kanban and to recognize that they're different.
Right. Alex, I also can sort of clarify that yes, Eric Ries does have WIP limits and pull in the method, in the system that he describes.
In that case, it's reasonable for him to say that there's a Kanban system element to what he's doing. Great.
Another, I would say, somewhat philosophical question, but interesting nevertheless, is from Elder Clay Rini. I hope that I'm pronouncing the first name correctly. That tools are not substitute for better human behavior, but how can we use tools to help people get better?
What do we mean by tools in the context of this question? Is a Kanban system a tool, or do we mean something very specific like Swift-Kanban, an electronic software Kanban board?
And perhaps Elder Clay could clarify that.
Yeah, so can we come back to this question?
Sure, so let's come back to that.
Of what tools means in that context.
Okay. And so there is a question from Dominica, and I think that's a general knowledge question that would be useful for all participants. How can Kanban be used for portfolio management?
Okay. Well, Dominica is one of my colleagues, and as one of my other colleagues, Mike Burrows, points out, we're still learning how Kanban can be used for portfolio management. And it's interesting that Mike would say that, because he actually did a portfolio management level implementation at a risk management company based in England and Hungary over the last couple of years. So he's one of the more experienced proponents of Kanban at the portfolio level, and even he feels that we don't really know how to do it yet. It is clear that some companies are using Kanban at a portfolio level. Perhaps one of the best known implementations is Mobile Day based in Berlin in Germany, with the chief architect Markus Andrzejak. And Markus wrote a supplementary chapter to my Kanban book in the German translation. So the German version of my book has a 21st chapter which describes their portfolio level implementation. What we do observe is that at the portfolio level, projects really don't flow. They're either waiting to start, they're in progress, or they're done. And unless you were in a very traditional waterfall phase gate style process, projects don't really flow, because a project could be in requirements, analysis, design, testing, coding, and various other levels of testing all at once. So you can't really put columns on the board and say this project's in requirement development, and it's in analysis, and it's in design, and so on. That would be viable in a very traditional waterfall phase gate style, but that would really be all. It's very clear that the visualization in Kanban helps portfolio level implementations, and often companies discover that they have way more projects in progress than they realized that they had, and limiting those helps immensely, but it's still an area that we're very much learning from. And if you have a successful portfolio management implementation, we would love to hear from you. I'm sure that I and Dominica and Mike would love to hear from anyone who has a case study and a story to tell us, and can put some analysis around exactly what they're doing with Kanban at the portfolio level and how they are implementing it. I think the one more thing I'd like to say is it depends what you mean by portfolio. If we look at some of the bigger projects that we've done with Kanban, they're huge in comparison to what some people refer to as projects or a portfolio. The large project that Daniel Vacanti managed for me in 2007 had a total budget in the region of $11 million, and the larger requirements there were about 110 of them. So that's $100,000 per requirement, and we were breaking those out into user stories somewhere in the order of 20 to 22 per requirement. So each user story was about $5,000 worth of budget. Well, we could visualize 5 concurrent requirements in development on a single Kanban board, 1 lane for each item. So that's $500,000 worth of software development on a single Kanban board. And then upstream of that, there were 15 more in analysis, which was the elaboration of the requirement into a set of user stories. Or put another way, that's now $2 million worth of development on a single board. For some companies, that's an entire project portfolio. So again, we need to put some definition around what do we mean by portfolio before we really try to understand how people might be using it.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great sort of characterization of the current state of affairs. We've also talked to several organizations that are dealing with what would appear to be similar problems. Clearly, there is the classic portfolio management where you're looking at just visualizing what is the overall pipeline, what is the current work in progress, what are the things that might need to be retired and replaced with something new, versus a typical IT type of organizations which are looking to manage multiple boards or multiple projects simply because the work that's coming in requires work to be done by multiple teams, and each of them have their own boards. So they just want a cohesive sort of consolidated view with the ability to drill down to individual boards, but that could also potentially be termed as a portfolio of projects, because for the IT ops achieve, that's an important task as part of their job. So, but you're right. We are also learning from what we hear from our customers, and clearly trying to put together a consolidated set of features that would ultimately lead up to portfolio management in an effective way. So I just wanted to clarify, Elder Clay Rini. I'm sorry about any mispronunciations of name, but she or he clarified that when they said tools, they meant they said any tool in general, but specifically electronic tools. And this is in the context of the previous question, that tools are not substitute for better human behavior, but how can we use tools to help people get better?
So I think what we understand about Kanban is that the tools are helping engage people emotionally as well as logically. That a Kanban board and an electronic tool projected on a wall or something provides a visualization and perhaps even a tactile engagement with the work, which allows a group of people to form some shared understanding about the quantity of work, the dynamics of the process, and the challenges that are affecting them. And that emotional engagement provides a motivation for change in a much greater way than simple logical tools like charts and graphs might do. Although a chart or a graph could be an emotional tool if it visualizes something in a particular way. But certainly data in a spreadsheet or date stamps in a tracking system are mostly logical tools. So the tools are really there to help engage the different intelligences of individuals, their logical, their emotional intelligence, and to help provide motivation and shared understanding and motivation across a group of people. And it's those things that change human behavior, that we're enhancing communication and understanding using the tools.
Absolutely. And as a tool vendor and someone who's worked with a variety of tools over the last so many years, I can certainly add to that our experience has been that unless business policy and overall management vision were not clear, use of tools would simply not would not be effective. So unless sort of basic groundwork had been done and teams that were looking to implement tools were clear about what specific value they were looking to get from those tools, they were almost certain to fail. So certainly from that perspective, tools help in terms of providing visibility, providing more accurate information, more on-time information. But how do you use that to effect change and to affect teams' performances is completely up to the organization itself. Couple of sort of questions which are again broad questions, David. Let me start with the first one, which is come to us from numerous customers here as well. That is there a formal certification for Kanban similar to Scrum? And if there isn't one right now, is there something that is in the works?
So the answer to the first question is no, there isn't. And the answer to the second question is that there are a number of companies around the world teaching Kanban or working with us to offer classes, and there's a recognition in the market that we would like to somehow communicate where there is good quality to those training classes and knowledgeable trainers. And as part of that, relatively recently we introduced the concept of an approved Kanban trainer, which is a designation which is awarded from the Lean Kanban University. It's a joint venture company owned by Alan Shalloway and I. So there are a number of approved Kanban trainers around the world. I can't recall the exact number, somewhere between 10 and 20, working for firms mostly in Europe and perhaps Israel and South Africa. And we are certainly looking to expand that scheme and to use Lean Kanban University as a way of developing quality Kanban training and education in the marketplace, and certainly to find a way to communicate to the broader audience and consumers of such training that there is good quality and that there are trainers that we trust more and that they're using curriculum that we trust. It's become evident in the last 2 or 3 months that there are other people teaching Kanban or offering Kanban training, and these are often people that we've never heard of. They're not part of the Kanban community. They don't show up in our online forums. They don't show up at our conferences. We haven't seen them present material at our conferences. And when we look at what they're teaching, it's often very poor quality. So we feel that the market is now sufficiently developed that we need to put some control around the definition of quality and help consumers understand whether they're receiving good quality Kanban education from a good quality source. And we're continuing to develop that through Lean Kanban University, and there will be some announcements in 2012.
Okay, great. You mentioned earlier that there are some approved trainers that are already there. So when you said approved, do you mean approved by the Lean Kanban University?
That's correct.
Okay.
That designation came out of the Kanban Leadership Retreat event that took place in Reykjavik at the end of June.
Right.
And I'm looking across the room at one of my colleagues to find out if we have that list published anywhere on the internet, the list of approved Kanban trainers. So I'm told that the list will appear on Lean Kanban University, and I suspect that it will be updated relatively frequently. So if people are interested in finding Kanban training that meets with the standards that Alan Shalloway and I would expect, then Lean Kanban University is the destination site to go look for that. And within that site we will be listing approved trainers, and those are individuals working for companies offering Kanban training. You'll also notice that we will be announcing a list of companies that are affiliated with Lean Kanban University that are offering Kanban training. They will be able to list training classes on that website, and we intend to build Lean Kanban University into the destination site. If you have the question, where can I get some Kanban training in my region of the world and ensure that it's of good quality, the answers to those questions should be on leankanbanuniversity.com.
Fantastic. So I guess the audience attention should be to leankanbanuniversity.com to get answers to those questions. So this is probably the final question that we'll take up today, David, and this is the question that has been taken up in previous webinars as well, but I think might be worth talking about it briefly here as well. And that is the question about use of Kanban by distributed teams. I know when I read it in your book that one of the first experience that you had on using Kanban was with the distributed teams when you had teams in Seattle and in Hyderabad. So definitely, I think there is enough awareness about this already. But I think if we could kind of quickly, or rather, take up at your pace what should be the sort of standard or effective strategies for using Kanban when you're in a distributed team situation, that would be great.
Yeah, so that's true that the very early implementations always had a distributed element to them. The first few that we did either had all the testing done in Chennai in India, or an earlier one, the entire development and testing team was in Hyderabad in India. So distributed nature has always been part of it, and some form of electronic tool has always been part of it. And solving the Kanban for distributed teams requires an electronic Kanban board tool such as Swift-Kanban. And there are clearly some challenges. The sort of Kaizen culture that's described in the book tends to emerge within geographic regions rather than across the geographic distribution. So if you want improvements to happen across regions, if the process is such that the challenges are between the independent groups rather than within them, that requires some management intervention. The book focuses on really shop floor, individual contributor driven Kaizen, anyone on the team suggesting an improvement and the team implementing the improvements, often without management intervention. But if you want to drive improvements across teams located in different geographies, line managers and more senior managers must get involved. They must have visibility across those groups. They need to use the electronic tools. They need to use the data that those tools are providing. And they need to have some form of meeting to create a feedback mechanism across the organization. So they need to be having operations reviews where they're looking at the capability and performance of the whole organization across the multiple geographies using the data and visualization that the electronic tools are providing. So the improvements and the Kaizen events will be driven from management suggestions. So managers need to be a lot more involved if you're going to really produce a Kaizen culture using Kanban across multiple geographies, and electronic tools are essential.
Excellent. I think again, from our experience as well, I think almost, I would say 90%, maybe a little less, 80% of the organizations that we talk to are in that situation where they have distributed teams, and they have in some ways already tackled that problem of being able to work across time zones and geographical locations. In the case of specific adoption of Kanban, they're looking for further guidance, or they have some pretty clear ideas about it. But certainly, they're able to use it successfully once they get used to some of the basic practices that you described just now, such as daily stand-ups and greater involvement of management and other such things. So with that, David, we will close out today's webinar. So did you have any closing remarks that you want to address to the overall audience?
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for being part of it. I think these are useful opportunities. and we continue to do them regularly. So thanks again. I hope we'll see some more of you back again with more questions in future. That's really all I've got, Mahesh.
All right. Thanks very much, David. Great as always to listen to you, discussing these very real life questions. And thank you to the entire audience today for sending in some great questions and participating in the discussion. And hopefully, you all benefit from this as much as and enjoy it as much as we do. Thanks once again, and we will follow this up with emails that will give you links to download the slides as well as to get to the recording of the webinar. And if you have any other questions that did not get addressed during the conference, please do send us additional questions about that to either to David or to us at Digite, and we'd be happy to get back to you. Thanks again, everybody. Goodbye.